Have you ever tried to cook a recipe like at somebody else's house or in a different kitchen and it just didn't turn out the same? I had that happen. We were on vacation last week. We live in Florida and we were on vacation in Tennessee, staying at an Airbnb. And I made a breakfast casserole recipe that I make a lot. And it just didn't turn out the same. I used the same ingredients, nothing changed there. But what I realized later was that the environment changed. We live in Florida. We're at sea level, and we were in Tennessee at a little bit of elevation. The oven I have at home is electric versus that was a gas, propane stove and oven. And the other thing was, since we were traveling, I used one of those aluminum pans rather than my, normal baking dish that I use. So what happened was that the outcome changed because of the environment, not necessarily because of the inputs. I still baked it at, 375 like I always do, but it took so much longer to cook. It seemed like the middle was still a little runny. We had to keep checking it, add more time before it was finally done. And the thing that hit me, obviously, if you guys have listened to this podcast, I love analogies. I thought this was a great analogy for what happens when we're gaining weight in midlife. Your inputs are the same, you're following the same, eating the same you always have, exercising the same you always have, but all of a sudden you're gaining. Well, what's going on is that the environment changed and nobody's probably going to explain that to you. So, I'm going to break this down today. What's actually happening in your body that's contributing to that belly fat gain? We're going to break it down so that you can let that shame and blame go. And also so that you can understand once we know what's happening, then we know what we can do to reverse it. Let's break it down today.
This
Before
is
we
Her
dive into
Genetic
this
Edge with
episode,
Lori
I do
Aiken,
just want
a
to
podcast helping women
reinforce
make
to
sense
you
of hormones,
that if
genetics,
you
and the
have
midlife
gained weight
transition
in
through
midlife,
practical
especially if you're gaining
conversations
that
around
belly
health.
fat,
This
I want you to
podcast is
be
for
able
educational
to
purposes
take
only
the
and
shame,
is
the
not
blame, the
intended to
guilt
replace medical
off
advice. Please
today
consult your
by
healthcare provider
understanding
before
what's
making changes to
physiologically
your care.
happening in your body. And so you can realize it's not just your fault. I have experienced that. My weight gain story like that was actually back in my late 20s. There were hormonal things going on that I didn't understand at the time. And I really carried a lot of shame and blame for years until I understand there was more going on. It wasn't just that I was eating more and exercising less and it was all my fault. So if you felt that way, you can let that go today. And I'm going to break down what's really going on. And the important part I want to talk about is that there's a couple things. Is one, when we know what's actually happening, when we understand why it's happening, then we know it's like, okay, when I finally find the leak, I know what needs to be repaired to fix the problem. The same thing with the weight gain. When we know what's going on with your body, now we know what we can do to reverse and cause some weight loss in midlife. And the other thing is that belly fat gain is about more, yes, the cosmetic side. I know you're looking in the mirror and you're going, I feel like I'm looking at somebody else. Your clothes don't fit the same. You just don't feel, maybe your confidence is down, things like that. But the important part about belly fat gain in midlife is what's it associated with. When we gain that belly fat, we're at increased risk for cardiometabolic disease. So this is things like high cholesterol, high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, stroke risk. These are the things. Disease is what kills us and decreases our quality of life. So number one killer in women is heart disease, especially later, and that risk goes up, when we go through our midlife transition. Um, and even if it doesn't kill us, it definitely affects our quality of life. So we're talking about so much more than something that's cosmetic today. We're literally talking about you having a longer and healthier life. All right, so let's actually break down what's happening. So, first, I think this is probably intuitive. You might know this, but both men and women essentially, as we age, part of the aging process is that we lose muscle mass. So we have something called growth hormone, HGH, human growth hormone. When we're kids, it helps us to literally grow, get taller, our arms get longer, our legs get longer, all of that. But then when we reach maturity, when we reach our height, growth hormone then helping us to build and maintain muscle. In as early as our 30s, our growth hormone starts declining. And so we really have to work extra hard after that to build and maintain our muscle. So, as yes, a natural consequence of aging, we're gonna lose muscle mass. And the thing about that is that muscle burns up to, it's like more than 3 times the amount of calories than fat does. So, think if our body composition is essentially shifting from having less muscle to having potentially more fat. Even if we're just having less muscle, our metabolism is going to decrease. And so if we're still eating the same diet, we can be gaining weight because we're essentially eating more that we need. But there's more going on here. So there's especially for women. So we used to think that I think people used to think years ago, like estrogen, progesterone was just like a reproductive organ thing. It just affected our periods. It just affected like childbirth, all that kind of stuff. But what we know is that estrogen affects our whole body. But one of the things estrogen affects that we've known now for as far as I know back to 2018 is that estrogen actually directly affects your mitochondria. So your mitochondria are, if you took a I would say if you took a high school or a college, biology class, you would have learned that the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. So you're literally we make energy to be able me talking to you right now. My body is actually needs energy to be able for my cells, my mouth to move, me to think, things like that. So our body actually makes energy in the mitochondria of the cell. Well, guess what? Estrogen actually affects that mitochondria. So back in 2018, as far as I understand, this was the first study that showed this connection. There was a study done on mice. It showed that what they do a lot of times is they'll take mice and they remove their ovaries. So they surgically induce menopause. And some women have had this. If you've had a hysterectomy or if you've had ovaries removed for some reason, right? Your body no longer produces those hormones to the degree that it did prior. So they do this in mice. And what they found was that estrogen, when they lost the estrogen from the removal of the ovaries, it reduced oxygen consumption and total energy expenditure at rest. So oxygen consumption basically tells us what somebody's metabolism is doing. We actually did this in the hospital, and when I worked in the ICU years ago, that's how we would figure out how much calories if somebody was on life support and they couldn't eat, we were feeding them through other means. They would do this test through measuring how much oxygen somebody consumes and carbon dioxide they expire. They can figure out what somebody's metabolism is. So essentially, they found that when these mice lost estrogen, their metabolism decreased. They didn't use as much energy. Their oxygen consumption went down, and then their energy expenditure or their at rest decreased. And the interesting part was when they gave supplemental estrogen, when they gave the mice back estrogen, these effects were reversed. So since that time, there's been other studies that there was also a study in 2018 that looked at essentially the energy of the brain with estrogen loss. And there's been other studies done since that time that have continued to show this link. So, yes, your metabolism very well may be slower from decreasing estrogen in perimenopause and menopause. But I just want to point out, I should have done this in the beginning. Menopause is again that time when your ovaries you stop ovulating, you stop cycling, you stop ovulating, your ovaries stop producing follicles. And so that the ovarian hormone production goes down. So you've got little to no estrogen, progesterone. Perimenopause, up to 10 years before then, those hormones are going to slowly decline. So we see when we look at population studies, we see where women leading up 3 to 5 years before menopause will have a change in body composition and gain weight and also change the body composition. So we'll break this down a little bit more. So that was reason number one, you might be gaining weight in midlife. Reason number two, something else that happens is that your ovaries, so again, estrogen is made in the ovaries. The majority of your estrogen is made in the ovaries, and your ovaries actually use LDL cholesterol in order to do that. So if you've had, most likely, if you're in your 40s, you've probably had a cholesterol panel done at some point. They checked total cholesterol, they checked probably triglycerides. HDL and LDL, if not more than that. But those are kind of the basic components. So that LDL cholesterol, which is sometimes called the bad cholesterol, I don't think that's a good name for it because we actually use that LDL cholesterol to make estrogen. So what happens is that essentially when let's say it even just decreases. Normally your estrogen, let's say, was at 200 picograms per ml. Well, you're in perimenopause and now if we checked your estrogen level, it's now 70 picograms per ml. So it's making less than half the amount of estrogen that it was. Guess what? It's using less of that LDL cholesterol. So that LDL cholesterol is now running around in your bloodstream. So this is why it could be why, of course, if diet change, things like that. But if you've literally changed nothing and say you hit 45 and now your cholesterol has gone up, it may be because of decreasing estrogen, not necessarily because you have changed anything that you're doing from a lifestyle standpoint. The thing to tie back to my original point is it's not just when we have that increase in LDL cholesterol, that's where that risk of those cardiometabolic diseases is going up again, like obesity, especially central obesity, meaning we gaining our weight in the middle, our midsection, insulin resistance, which leads to prediabetes and diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, heart disease, strokes, things of that nature. So, okay, let's talk about something else. Now, we've got reason number three. What's going on is our metabolism slows down. So, that estrogen loss slows down that mitochondrial function. Our metabolism is literally decreasing. But something else that happens is estrogen loss down regulates the genes that control something called beta oxidation. Beta oxidation is essentially our body's ability to make energy from fat. So, back to our high school biology, if you ever learned about the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, it's how our body makes energy. And essentially, it makes energy from carbs in a process called glycolysis or fat in a process called beta oxidation. So when we lose estrogen, the genes that control beta oxidation are downregulated. So our ability to burn fat, to use fat as fuel decreases. So essentially, we could potentially have more fat on board and then less ability to be able to burn that fat as well. And this is interesting because using fat for energy is significant. It can normally, prior to midlife transition, accounts for up to 40 to 60% of your body's energy production. So think if we're using that as like a significant decrease then with that estrogen loss. So, all right, we so we've got more fat on board. We can't use it for energy. Then what's the shift? Why is it all going to the belly? Let's talk about what's happening there. And part of this comes down to the receptors on our fat cells. So our fat cells have receptors. In particular, there's some receptors called alpha 2 adrenergic receptors. And when we are prior to our midlife transition, so prior to perimenopause, menopause, when we're in our, more childbearing years, we have our estrogen causes us to have more receptors, fat cell receptors accumulate in our hips and thighs. And so those alpha 2 adrenergic receptors essentially cause us to store fat. So that's why, you may gain weight in the hips and thighs earlier in life. Then with that estrogen loss, we have less accumulation of those. And you can't see in this video, but I'm like literally, I talk with my hands a lot. So I'm like putting my hands around my hips and thighs. When we lose that estrogen, so we've got less accumulation of fat in the hips. And the other place we have those alpha 2 adrenergic receptors is in our abdominal cavity, in that viscera. So when we are particularly under stress then, and we've got less receptors coming in our hips and thighs, that fat then is going to get stored preferentially into the viscera, into the belly fat. And the thing to think about is when we are in perimenopause and menopause, one of the things that happens is progesterone is going to decrease. And progesterone has a calming effect on our nervous system. When we have decrease or loss of progesterone, our nervous system is essentially more susceptible to stress. So we have like this whole cascade of things that's happening then where we're more susceptible to stress. We've got less receptors on the fat cells in our hips and thighs. That when we're under stress, we're going to gain that belly fat, that, cortisol belly, sometimes people call it. That's going to happen more readily when we are in perimenopause and menopause because of that hormonal changes. So I think it's one, the estrogen is affecting it, but two, that progesterone loss is affecting it as well. And another point I should make is what is visceral fat specifically? So I could, pinch some fat next to my belly button right now. It's on my belly, but visceral fat is something different. So I have my skin, I have some fat on the outside. Then I have my abdominal muscles. So then I have something called fascia behind that. And then inside there is like my peritoneal cavity. You have like a lining inside and then all your organs. Visceral fat in particular is fat that gets deposited in between the organs. It's not the outside fat, it's the inside fat that's in between their organs. And again, this visceral fat is what increases our risk for those cardiometabolic diseases. So that those estrogen changes are really making us susceptible here. So I've given you four things that are going on, but I've got two more for you. I've got number five and number six, some things that are happening, contributing to that belly fat gain in midlife. What's interesting is that your bone marrow actually makes fat cells. So your bone marrow is like think of if you've ever eaten, I always think of as a kid, we would eat, a whole chicken. A lot of times my parents would cook a whole chicken and maybe other people's parents did this. Like my dad sometimes would break the chicken bone and then eat the marrow out of the chicken. So we have in our bones, right? We've got marrow in the middle of our bones. And that marrow has stem cells. You have something called mesenchymal stem cells. And those mesenchymal stem cells can essentially, they hit a fork in the road and they either go one way and they become bone forming cells called osteoblasts, or they become adipocytes, which are fat cells. So again, I mentioned earlier, all the cells in our body have estrogen receptors. So when estrogen comes and attaches on the alpha estrogen receptor on those mesenchymal cells, it essentially causes more of those mesenchymal cells to become the bone building cells or those osteoblasts. So as you can guess, as you lose estrogen, as your estrogen decreases or goes totally low, like in postmenopause, what will happen is those receptors are not getting estrogen is not combining with those alpha estrogen receptors. So those mesenchymal cells shift from becoming more osteoblasts to becoming adipocytes. And the thing is, they're called bone marrow derived adipocytes. They go specifically to the viscera. So they become visceral fat. So not only are we like depositing more fat there, but we're also like putting new fat cells there coming from the bone marrow. This is also why one of the reasons why when women have that estrogen loss, they're at risk for things like osteoporosis, osteopenia, because they've got less of those mesenchymal cells building the bone and more becoming fat. And we're seeing this whole body composition change where in that midlife transition and post midlife, our lean body mass decreases, which is made of our muscle, our bone, connective tissue, and then our fat mass increases. So let's talk about one more thing that's contributing to this belly fat gain. So we've got more belly fat, we're making it faster, and we're storing it there instead of our hips and thighs. But two other things that are going on is there's something called an adipose tissue lipoprotein lipase. This is an enzyme that essentially does get affected by estrogen as well. It becomes more active with estrogen loss. And what that enzyme does is it will go and get triglycerides from the blood and store them in the fat cells. Essentially, those fat cells can grow more because of this enzyme being more active. But then the other thing that can happen, again, that visceral fat is more responsive to stress, right? We talked about that earlier. When our body is more susceptible to being under stress when we lose progesterone. So say stress happens, our nervous system is triggered and we're under stress. When that sympathetic nervous system is triggered, one of the things that your body does is it releases stored energy in order to be used as fuel. And so what happens is that that visceral fat is going to release fatty acids into the bloodstream faster than fat in other areas of the body. And the problem is the fat in the viscera goes straight to the liver. So you might have, if you've heard of anyone that's got fatty liver disease, this is the connection here. And the problem is when we have lots of fat going to the liver, this is where insulin resistance starts. Too much to dive into the pathophysiology of that today. We'll save that for another episode. But overall, you can see we've got multiple mechanisms that are contributing to that storage of that belly fat, specifically visceral fat in perimenopause and menopause in midlife. So I want you to take that. Like, this can sound really overwhelming. It can sound like, oh my gosh, the odds are just stacked against me. But I want you to take that and go, okay, there's actually real things happening in my body that are contributing to this. But two, the other point is all of these mechanisms come from the loss of estrogen. And this is where I think HRT can play a huge role. Now, there's plenty of people that are still confused about HRT and estrogen and increasing risk of breast cancer. In fact, I had a woman comment on one of my posts on TikTok just yesterday, and she said, "Wait, I thought estrogen was the enemy." And you can see here from this what we've talked about so far is that estrogen really does play a huge role for us, especially when it comes to our metabolic health. And I think of estrogen as more like a Goldilocks. We want to have enough. Yes, we don't want to have too much estrogen and really more that imbalance of estrogen and progesterone. But there's also real risk factors that come when we don't have enough estrogen. And so what I want to give you a today, something that can benefit you. Again, we're going to talk about what we can do about belly fat and how to lose weight in midlife in upcoming episodes. But today I want to give you my midlife hormone roadmap. What I find is that so many women cannot find the care they need for HRT and just navigating hormones in midlife. Maybe even just testing and seeing, do I have normal levels of hormones? Are my hormones decreasing? So I created something called the Midlife Hormone Roadmap. It is a 17-page ebook that breaks down how to test what's going on in perimenopause and menopause, how to test your hormones, when to test, what to test, best type of test to use, what are optimal levels. I break all of that down for you. It's no fluff. I promise it's literally just hitting the facts here for you. That's all laid out. And you can access that for free when you subscribe on to the podcast on Substack. So what you're going to do is go to laurieaikman.com. We'll put the link below in the show notes. But as soon as you go to laurieaikman.com, you'll see a little pop-up come where you can enter your email. That's just becoming a free subscriber on Substack. And as soon as you put your email in, you'll get an email response immediately that has the midlife hormone roadmap in there so that you can figure out maybe you're in that stage where the environment has changed, just like we talked about in the recipe. You're doing the things all the same as you've done before. You're eating the same, you're exercising the same, but you're gaining weight in the belly. You can't lose weight like you used to. Maybe it's time to look into your hormones. And so I want the midlife hormone roadmap to be that reference in your back pocket where you can figure out how to get your hormones tested, how to know if they're in optimal ranges, and what to do next. So again, I want to invite you to download that, become a free Substack subscriber, and you'll get that download right away. You'll then be just informed every week when we release a new podcast episode, but you'll also be informed of other articles and resources that we put out on Substack every week. I hope this episode was not too deep. I'd love to hear your feedback on it. Next week, we're going to be diving into HRT and weight loss and how that plays a role. You don't want to miss it, so make sure you subscribe. All right, I'll see you next week.